Jews and Arabs alike, have taken cover in bomb shelters. I've been in Israel when rockets were fired from Gaza into Sderot. I know the terror of running for cover with sirens blaring overhead, not knowing whether I'd make it in time. My heart goes out to the Israeli people. Yesterday, I attended an IDF briefing. Unlike Hamas, the Israeli Defense Forces target the terrorists, their rocket launchers, weapon stocks, and command centers, not civilians. When a democratic country is attacked by terrorists, it has the right and indeed the duty to protect its people. We must continue to stand with Israel. I pray for peace and all those who have lost loved ones. I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
Unanimous consent. Address the House 1 minute. Revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to discuss the importance of pipelines to our nation's energy use and national security. It should be obvious. But with the Colonial Pipeline being out of commission this week and the resulting gas shortages, price spikes, and long lines at the gas pump, this highlights the importance of this method of transit. Pipelines offer guaranteed, reliable delivery and are cheaper and safer than any other delivery method. The extremely rare event of a pipeline being out of commission shows how much we often take their dependability for granted. We have 2.5 million miles of energy-related pipe in this country. If it can be completed, the Keystone Pipeline, the fourth phase, only 1,179 miles, would make our energy security even stronger. I'm hopeful that the events of the past week will cause the Biden administration and many of my friends across the aisle to rethink their hostility towards this project. Let's work on protecting these systems from cyber attacks. Let's work to build redundancy systems to operate these attacks when they get through. Let's also remember that what the alternative is when dogmatic policies get in the way and take options off the table. We will continue to need these fuels for the foreseeable future, and I hope we can agree to that smart course of action is to embrace the most efficient and safe manner of delivery. I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Virginia seek recognition?
I ask unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute and revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection, the gentlewoman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Country and their fellow Americans. On behalf of the people of Central Virginia and on behalf of a grateful nation, I thank the Capitol Police and the Washington Metropolitan Police for their heroism and their bravery. And I honor the lives and the legacies of those we have lost: Officer Brian Sicknick, Officer Howie Liebengood, Officer Billy Evans, and Officer Jeffrey Smith. Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentleman from North Carolina seek recognition?
I ask unanimous consent to address this Congress for 1 minute.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, National Police Week presents a unique opportunity to honor police officers nationwide. In my district, we have great respect for law enforcement, and we honor those who give their lives in the line of duty. Today, I wanted to draw attention to the Law Enforcement Officer Memorial Service being observed this weekend in my hometown of Henderson County. 10 North Carolina officers made the ultimate sacrifice this year in defense of their communities and loved ones. Their memory will never be forgotten. In my district, Deputy Sheriff Ryan Hendricks lost his life in a gunfight this year, bravely protecting his community from harm. His family are personal friends of mine, and my heart goes out to them as we remember his bold sacrifice. I would now call for a moment of silence to honor the 10 North Carolina officers who have lost their lives this year in the line of duty. Thank you all. And with that, I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Texas seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I ask for unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute and to revise and my remarks if necessary.
Without objection, the
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, I want to congratulate my friend, Maria Esther Estrada Campos, on receiving the Honorary Doctor of Humane Letters from the University of Houston. Esther has been a trailblazer in public education, a public servant, and a champion for civil rights. After Jeff Davis, now Northside High School, she went to the University of Houston. While raising 4 children of her own, Esther completed her degree and became one of the first bilingual instructors hired by the Houston Independent School District, and later a counselor and an assistant principal, something that was almost unheard of back in the 50s. All of this was nearly unheard of, but she continued on. She retired early from HISD to win a seat on its board of trustees. In Houston, if people were organizing for the betterment of the Latino community, Esther Campos was there. Esther continued her own education and began earning a PhD, but serious family challenges made it impossible for her to finish. We hope that an honorary degree from her alma mater serves as a recognition for all that she has done. Congratulations, Esther. Great work. Felicidades. Bien hecho. Thank you, and I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Texas seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute and to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection, the gentlewoman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to honor the life of Linda Leila Susan Maroney, known to all of us as Muffy, who died recently in her home at the age of 77. Muffy was born here in Washington, D.C. during World War II, but she was raised in and around Houston, and she was a Texan through and through. A lawyer by training and an advocate at heart, she fought to make our community, our country, and our world a better place. A mother, a lay leader, a champion, Muffy worked for equality for all, dignity for all, justice for all, especially for women. And she did so while treating everyone she met with respect, including those who saw things differently. Her spirit will live on in her sons, Justin and Robert, in her grandchildren, and in the work she did, the groups she organized, the causes she championed, and the things that she did for all of us in Texas and for all Americans. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
Ask unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute and to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, I rise today in light of the recent rocket attacks launched by Hamas against our close friend and ally, Israel. As we all know, those who have visited Israel many times, Israelis like to say they live in a tough neighborhood. It's a volatile region with hostile neighbors. Israeli citizens and children live under the shadow of an everlasting threat of rocket attacks, suicide bombings, and looming violence. Israel is really the only true democracy in the region, and they have a right to defend themselves from attacks, and they must. These attacks over the last weeks are just the most recent examples. They mark the worst escalation of the conflict since 2014, resulting in the deaths of over 70 people. As Hamas' incessant rocket barrages continue, more civilian lives are put at risk, including innocent Palestinians. They also further endanger any possibility of peace. That's their goal. As a key ally in the region and a longtime friend of the United States, we must support Israel's right to defend itself and de-escalate the violence, use our influence to do whatever we can to support our friend. I yield back the balance of my time.
For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Florida seek recognition?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I ask unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute and to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection, the gentlewoman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A 63-year-old grandmother, Leah, was sitting in her house near Tel Aviv. Ido, a 5-year-old boy, was home with his big sister and his mom in a small Israeli city near Gaza. Nadine, an Arab Israel 10th grader, was driving with her mom and dad in Jerusalem. What do they have in common? Their families are shattered and heartbroken. Leo and Ido and Nadine were all murdered by Hamas rockets bombarding Israel cities. In the last few days, Hamas terrorists have launched over 1,500 rockets, blowing up homes, schools, and buses. Thankfully, Iron Dome has stopped most. So millions of Israelis are forced to sleep and eat in bomb shelters as red alert sirens blare across the country. The violence is a cynical Hamas power grab, using policy disputes as an excuse for terrorism. Let me make it clear. I agree with President Joe Biden. Israel has a right to defend itself when you have thousands of rockets flying into your territory. Hamas must end its attack, and the United States and allies must help bring calm. Thank you. I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Pennsylvania seek recognition?
To seek unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute.
Without objection, the gentlewoman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to recognize the Yeadon Police Department, which recently started the first police community garden in the country as part of an ongoing program to develop positive relationships between police and community members. The garden gives officers and residents an opportunity to meet in a cooperative environment, to open lines of communication and foster understanding. Officers and residents work together in the garden throughout the growing season, and the food grown there is shared with those who work the soil as well as area food banks. They hope to start 6 or 7 more gardens throughout the community. The mayor of Yeadon, Mayor Hepkins, says that his community has seen a decrease in crime during the pandemic and credits police outreach efforts, including the department's reliance on community-oriented policing, outreach to the school district and younger folks, so they look at the police not as enemies, but as allies. I commend Police Chief Anthony Chachi Paparo and Mayor Hepkins for their efforts to improve community policing and to ensure that everyone in the community feels safe. I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Indiana seek recognition?
I ask unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Madam Speaker, as the co-chairman of the Congressional Steel Caucus, I was honored last week to help facilitate a letter to the Appropriations Committee. This letter expressed our support for the International Trade Administration and the International Trade Commission, which are incredibly important to the success of the American steel industry and its workforce. The letter encouraged the committee to build on its previous efforts to provide adequate resources to the ITA and the ITC, so they may ensure timely and objective responses to trade, remedy, complaints, and investigations. Their work is essential to upholding our trade laws and ensuring that all American workers can compete on a level playing field. I look forward to continuing to work with the members of the committee and the Steel Caucus to support these agencies and strength of American steelworkers and the manufacturers. Thank you, and I yield back my time. Under the Speaker's announced policy of January 4th, 2021, the gentlewoman from Florida, Ms. Kamek, is recognized for 60 minutes as the designee of the Minority Leader.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks and submit extraneous materials. Thank you. Mr. Speaker, I rise today to celebrate and honor police officers across our country. As we commemorate National Police Week, I can't help but to think about the barrage of attacks that our LEOs have come under in recent months and years. Police officers have constantly been vilified by the media and those in left-wing politics for just simply doing their jobs. It is a job that comes with significant challenges and dangers and is often thankless at best. This time, I'd like to thank my colleagues here today for joining me for this special order to honor our heroes in blue. And I would like to take an opportunity to thank our police officers all across this nation for their work and sense of duty. They walk the beat and meet people at their worst moments, all while maintaining professionalism and a steadfastness to the rule of law. This is a job that affects not only the individual officer, but their entire family. Husbands and wives, sons and daughters worry if their loved one will return home from a shift. This fear is very real and very raw. As the wife to a first responder, I too have felt this fear and dread as my husband Matt drives to a SWAT call-out. Too often, these brave men and women in uniform don't make it back after that shift. They pay the ultimate price for their bravery, and their families are left to pick up the pieces. Just this year alone, we have lost too many brave officers in the line of duty. Today, I will honor them here today by saying each of their names. Their memories and bravery will be recorded in the congressional record and etched into the archives of American history. Their names are as follows. Sergeant Gordon Best, Sergeant Daniel Mobley, Lieutenant Jeff Bain, Deputy Sheriff Nicholas Howell, Sergeant Randall Sims, Deputy Sheriff Jonathan Price, Officer Jay Hughes, Officer Brian Sicknick, Sergeant Jay Crumpler, First Sergeant Timothy Howell, Lieutenant William Gardner, Conservation Officer Stephen Regard, Officer Arturo Villegas, Officer Tyler Britt, Master Corporal Brian Levin, Agent Luis Marrero Diaz, Agent Luis Salomon Condi, Agent Eliza Hernandez Cartagena, Officer Melton Gore, Sergeant Frederick Cameron, Detective Stephen DeFoss, Officer Hector Moya, Chief of Police Tony Jordan, Corporal Christine Peters, Constable Sherry K. Langford, Lieutenant Treva Preston, Officer Alfred Jimenez, Officer Jerry Hemphill, Sergeant Edward Marcruella, Lieutenant John Reynolds, Officer Joseph Martini, Deputy Sheriff Adam Gibson, Officer Brandon Stalker, Warrants Officer Toby Kaiser, Deputy Sheriff Jacinto Navarro, Officer Byron Shields, Lieutenant Robert Van Zyl, Lieutenant Frank Arnold, Special Agent Wayne Snyder, Captain Michael Garrigan, Lieutenant Juan Rafael Rivera Padua, Deputy Sheriff Frank Gonzalez Halligan, Auxiliary Sergeant Luis Livatino, Director of Field Operations Beverly Good, Sergeant Tommy Cood, Sergeant Jeffrey Smith, Special Agent Robert Meyer, Sergeant William Bratigam, Correctional Officer Juan Llanes, Sergeant Grace Bellamy, Lieutenant Michael Boot, Special Agent Laura Ann Swartz-Zenberger, Special Agent Daniel Alphin, Detention Officer Robert Perez, Deputy Sheriff Jack Gwynns, Agent Juan Rosado Lopez, Patrolman Darian Girat, Detective Pedro Mejia, Officer Cesar Cibogona, Deputy Sheriff Ross Dixon, Officer Vicky James, Investigator Eddie Hutchinson, Chief of Police Timothy Sheehan, Deputy Sheriff Donald Gilreath, Police Officer Mitchell Penton, Officer Guerrero Guanero, Corrections Officer Taiwio Oble, Major Esteban Ramirez, Deputy Constable Manuel Felipe de Rosa, Sergeant Richard Brown, Deputy Sheriff Michael Maligi, Police Officer Horatio Dominguez, Lieutenant Eugene Lasco, Officer Jason Lagore, Patrol Officer Troy Maureen, Officer Carlos Mendoza, Deputy Sheriff Thomas Albanese, Reserve Deputy Constable Martinez Mitchum, Police Officer Dominic Winham, Captain Justin Bedwell, Police Officer Jose Anzora, Corrections Officer Tracy Adams, Officer Crispin San Jose, Officer Jesse Madsen, Sergeant Barry Henderson, Deputy Sheriff Stanley Burdick, Police Officer Gary Hibbs, Patrol Agent Alejandro Flores Benuelos, Police Officer Kevin Valencia, Sergeant LaShonda Owens, Police Officer Matt North, Police Officer Eric Talley, Chief of Police Fred Postovitz, Corrections Officer Robert McFarland, Senior Master Trooper Todd Hannikin, Corporal Kyle Davis, Trooper Joseph Gallagher, Sergeant Shane Owens, Reserve Deputy Sheriff James Driver, Trooper Chad Walker, Officer Luis Hernandez, Officer William Evans, Lieutenant James Kowski, Officer Brent Hall, Deputy Sheriff Joseph Gore, Deputy Sheriff Christopher Knight, Sergeant James Smith, Deputy Sheriff Thomas Barnes, Deputy Sheriff Carlos Hernandez, Border Patrol Agent Christopher Simpkins, Detention Deputy Mark Anderson, Officer Jimmy Garcia, Officer David Parde, Deputy Sheriff Terry Dyer, Deputy Sheriff Alexander Goods, Officer Anastasio Sykos, Corporal Keith Heacock, Sergeant Chris Ward, Deputy Sheriff Logan Fox, Officer Christopher Farr, Detective Luca Benedetti, Deputy Sheriff Samuel Leonard, Deputy Sheriff Stephen Jones, Officer Jimmy Inn. And I would also be remiss if I didn't mention our K-9 officers that also gave their life in the line of duty. K-9 Figo, K-9 Riley, K-9 Luna, K-9 Joker, K-9 Cosmo, and K-9 Django. Please join me in a moment of silence to remember these heroes. Thank you. As you can see, that's a pretty lengthy list. And I hope that even though I may have mispronounced some of their names, that their families seek comfort in knowing that their names will forever be remembered. Again, these are just some of the heroes that we have lost this year. It's May, and this list takes up 4 pages of paper. May we always remember their names and recognize their service in keeping law and order for our communities. To the brave men and women who we just named, rest easy. We've got the watch. At this time, I would like to recognize a good friend and sheriff of the great city, Jacksonville, and the great state of Florida. For the purposes of today, I would like to yield for as much time as he may consume, Sheriff Rutherford.
Thank you. Thank you, and I deeply appreciate your having read all those names. That is a promise that we make to these officers, and Congresswoman Kamak, I really congratulate you on that, and thank you so much for this opportunity. Mr. Speaker, this morning as I was laying a wreath at the National Law Enforcement Memorial, couldn't help but remember that this week, National Police Week, is really about promises made and promises kept. Although these 22,000 plus officers whose names appear at the National Memorial, although they all died in different ways, they all lived for the same purpose. They made this promise that, quote, as a law enforcement officer, my fundamental duty is to serve mankind, to safeguard lives and property, to protect the innocent against deception, the weak against oppression or intimidation, and the peaceful against violence and disorder, and to respect the constitutional rights of all men to liberty, equality, and justice. Mr. Speaker, that's the first paragraph of the Law Enforcement Officers Code of Ethics. That's a promise made by every law enforcement officer in the United States. That promise is kept every day when they put on that uniform and they go out to protect the peaceful against violence and disorder. Last year in 2020, 394 of those officers gave their last full measure of devotion to the communities they served after having taken that oath. They kept their promise. And during this National Police Memorial Week, we will keep our promise. Our promise to them that we will never forget their names and that of their families. Every year at this time, we pause to remember their lives. Mr. Speaker, not just their deaths and the way they died, but the way they lived. And this morning, I couldn't help but think of the words of Ralph Waldo Emerson as I thought about these officers. And he wrote that the purpose in life is not to be happy. It's to be useful, to be compassionate, to be honorable, and to have it make some difference that you lived and that you lived well. Those 22,000 names, more than 22,000 names that are on those memorial walls over there, those men and women lived well. Their names will never be forgotten. Their names are on the wall at the National Law Enforcement Memorial, 113 of them from my district. Just this year, we will add another 394 names to that memorial wall. These officers kept their promises. And tonight, at the National Memorial, the National Law Enforcement Officers Memorial, we will keep our promise and remember their names. God bless and keep these officers and their families who are the survivors. With that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
Thank you to my good friend, Sheriff in Jacksonville, Mr. Rutherford. At this time, Mr. Speaker, I would like to invite a true friend to law enforcement, fellow Floridian and veteran, Representative Franklin, for as much time as he may consume.
Thank you. And thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today during National Police Week when America joins our law enforcement community to honor our fallen officers. Sadly, our police force faces unprecedented attack. Last year, 264 enforcement officers were killed in the line of duty, nearly double the amount from 2019. And in only 1 year in all of American history, 1930, were there more law enforcement deaths. Despite these staggering losses, some in this body are seeking to defund the police, diminishing their ability to protect and defend our communities and themselves. While we must be ever vigilant to root out the bad apples, we cannot forget the overwhelming majority who put themselves in harm's way every day and serve with honor and integrity. I'm grateful for the efforts of the excellent law enforcement officials in my district. I stand with these incredible sheriffs and chiefs and the officers they lead, and I thank them for their service on behalf of the citizens of Florida. Thank you, and I yield back.
At this time, and thank you to the gentleman from Florida. At this time, I would like to invite my good friend from the great state of Louisiana, Representative Higgins, also a law enforcement officer and great patriot and friend, for as much time as he may consume.
I thank the gentlelady, my friend and colleague. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, to be a police officer it's not a, it's not something we do. It's someone that we are. I was a military police officer in the Army and went on to serve for 12 years as a uniformed police officer, 12 years SWAT operator, and buried far too many brothers. And there's a time in every man's heart where we have to make a decision what we're going to do with our life that day, that week, that month, with our families, with our career, with our life. And as I reflect upon my career as a police officer prior to my congressional service, I think about the 8.5 years of night shift and the exchange that my wife and I would have every evening as she returned from work and I was preparing to leave. She would have my little meal prepared, a little brown bag to take with me. And she would say, "Be safe, come home to me." And I would say, "Don't worry about me, worry about the other guy." Every police officer has a little exchange like that with their loved one before they begin their shift, because we don't know if we're coming home. We recognize that the life we've chosen to serve our fellow man is an effort somehow to become better men ourselves. It's an effort to serve a Lord that we're not quite worthy of. I've trained or helped train many officers through the years, and they would ask me sometimes about this section of the manual or that section of the manual, and I would always tell them the same. Your manual is 1,483 pages. Seek to be a better man, do the right thing, and you'll be worthy of the job and career that you've chosen. Forget that, and you will not. We are human. We've failed and fallen in some way, every one of us. This can be said as well about the members of this body. We wear a small pin upon our lapel that identifies us as congressmen and congresswomen. We're proud to serve and humbled to serve, and we do our best every day to be worthy of that service. And this job began with an oath. Imperfect though we be, variant though we be in our ideological perspective or our political affiliation, we do our best every day. Well, there are 1 million police officers across this country that don't have a little lapel pin. They wear a badge like this. And the mourning band upon that badge is in memory of the brothers and sisters of the thin blue line that we've lost. It used to be a rare thing to find your mourning band and put it on your badge. Now, these days, you can't get it off. Police officers out there know what I'm talking about. So I would say, Mr. Speaker, in closing, that the journey that we're upon in this life is a chosen path that all of us embrace. For better or for worse, we attempt to become better men and women, better children of God. Police officers are no different. I ask you to hear my heart, feel my spirit. The men and women that wear a badge deserve your respect, your love, and your support. And in this special time, this week, we memorialize forever those that we've lost that wear the badge. I thank the good lady for allowing me to address the House this day. I extend my love to the thin blue line, and I thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield.
Thank you to my good friend from the great state of Louisiana. At this time, I would like to recognize another great friend of law enforcement who knows truly what it is to be a man of law. My friend and sheriff, former sheriff of Fort Bend County, Texas, Representative Nels.
Thank you, Kat. Mr. Speaker, as a 30-year law enforcement veteran, I have seen the very best of our law enforcement officers. Brave, brave men and women who put their lives on the line each and every day to protect and serve our communities. I've seen law enforcement officers jump into floodwaters to save a pet, run into a fiery crash to save an unconscious victim, resuscitate and save the life of a criminal who just tried to shoot and kill them. I've also seen the dangers of serving in law enforcement. Hundreds of law enforcement officers are killed every year in the line of duty across our country. In 2021, 394 names of law enforcement officers killed in the line of duty were added to the National Law Enforcement Officers Memorial right here in Washington, D.C. And 59, yes, 59 of those brave men and women were from my home state of Texas. How many people in this chamber or watching at home can name any of the officers who died in the line of duty this year? I would say a very small percentage, if any at all. But how many know the name of George Floyd or Freddie Gray or Breonna Taylor? I would say the vast majority. What does that say about our media? What does it say about our culture? I think it's a testament to just how divided our country is today. A time where some of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle actually believe defunding or abolishing the police is a good idea. My friends, it is not rocket science to conclude that our society is built on rule of law and it requires law enforcement. Rather than recognize the bravery and service of the over 800,000 law enforcement officers in this country who do their job honorably, the far left has sought to demonize and defund our law enforcement based off the actions of a few who have failed to uphold their oath. Their hateful rhetoric has led to violence and destruction in cities across our country, and we saw it in Seattle, Minneapolis, Portland. City blocks burned, businesses destroyed, and lives ruined forever. And when faced with this violence in the streets, the far left doubled down on their hateful anti-law enforcement rhetoric and encouraged even more destruction. It may come to a surprise to many, but there are over 10 million, yes, 10 million arrests in our country every year. Most Americans never hear a word about the millions of arrests that happen without incident. And why is that? Because it doesn't sell headlines. It doesn't sell headlines, and it doesn't fit the left narrative. Darian Jarrett of New Mexico, Chris Ward of North Carolina, James Smith of Iowa, and Chad Walker from the great state of Texas. Know their names? I'm sure you don't, because their death didn't fit the left's narrative or sell headlines. All four of them were murdered in the line of duty for just trying to protect their communities. Are their years of service or sacrifice not worthy of remembrance or recognition? The media doesn't seem to think so. But the Republican Party, we stand with law enforcement. We support law enforcement. We celebrate law enforcement. We are the party of law enforcement. That's why I'm proud to stand here today as a 30-year law enforcement veteran during National Police Week to say to all my brothers and sisters in blue, we got your back. I yield back.
Thank you to our sheriff from the great state of Texas. I appreciate your remarks and thank you for your service, not just to Fort Bend, but to the great state of Texas and our country. Thank you. At this time, I would like to recognize my good friend from the wonderful state of Iowa, who may be the smallest in stature in our conference, but has the biggest heart. And at this time, I would like to recognize Representative Miller Meeks for as much time as she may consume.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to my good friend from Florida, Representative Kamek, the spouse of an incredible first responder, for yielding me time to speak this evening. This week is National Police Week, and it's excellent time to say thank you to the heroic men and women who put their lives at risk every day to keep us safe. These officers and their families have sacrificed so much to serve others that we must be doing more to keep them safe, well-funded, and supported. This past year has been challenging for all of us, but our police officers have been hit especially hard. Imagine what we have gone through with the pandemic, but being a first officer, police officer, and first responder during these difficult times. Many of my colleagues have called to reform, defund, and even abolish police departments. While I do believe that our policing system is in need of serious bipartisan and common sense reforms, I will never support defunding or abolishing the police. Those calling for defunding or abolishment of the police as serious policy are flat out wrong. Our communities need police to stay safe, they must be fully funded, and they deserve our respect and gratitude. Defunding or abolishing the police would make our communities less secure and more vulnerable to criminal activity, putting all of our families at risk. We must produce constructive ways to reform and improve our policing system, not strip departments of critical funding for training, equipment, community engagement programs, and body cameras. To reform our police system, we should focus on real solutions like empowering police chiefs to fire bad cops and improving police training and accountability in line with best practices, similar to the reforms I proudly supported as a state senator in Iowa. And earlier today, I signed on as a co-sponsor to the bipartisan Defund Cities That Defund the Police Act, introduced by Representatives Fitzpatrick, Golden, Stauber, and Lamb. This piece of legislation would prevent jurisdictions that defund the police from receiving certain federal grants, stopping specific federal taxpayer dollars from bankrolling jurisdictions that intentionally make their communities less safe. Under this legislation, any jurisdiction that chooses to defund the police is choosing to defund themselves of federal assistance. Municipalities around the country that wish to defund or abolish the police will only harm their communities. America does not need to defund or abolish the police. We need to fund and support law enforcement. It's interesting, my first tour of this building and the White House was my brother, who was a Secret Service agent in this city. We especially need to honor our fallen police officers, including Iowa State Patrol Officer Jim Smith, U.S. Capitol Police Officers Sicknick, Evans, Liebengood, Green, and Smith. And we also need to honor the sacrifice of Officer Goodman. Police officers are true public servants and protectors of our community who deserve our respect and appreciation. I am proud to back the blue this week and every week. Thank you, Congresswoman Kamek, for your fierce advocacy for our police officers and for organizing tonight's special order. I yield back my time.
Thank you to my great colleague and friend from the state of Iowa. Mr. Speaker, during this National Police Week, we have highlighted many officers who have met the call of duty with courage and unmatched service. Two such officers I would like to highlight today are from my district. In the great little tiny town of High Springs, Sergeant Gary Moore and Officer Mayuli Nodars. On April 28th, these two officers of the High Springs Police Department responded to a call about suspicious activity. Upon arriving on scene, they observed a suspect standing in the bathroom of a house with a knife and a victim yelling for help. After these two officers gave multiple commands, they forced entry into the bathroom and found the armed suspect, who was uncooperative. Based on their training and experience, they were able to disarm the suspect. Everyone on scene lived to see another day, thanks to the work and quick thinking of these officers. For their bravery and professionalism, they have been awarded the Medal of Valor. I thank these two officers for their quick thinking and decisive action. They show us what proper training and a well-funded police force can do to keep our communities safe. And as I stand here today, I know my husband is watching on shift from the station. So a quick hello to my husband, Matt, and thank you. I also would like to thank my colleagues for joining me here today. And a big thank you to every officer who gets up every day, puts on their vest, puts on their badge, walks out that door, not knowing if they will make it home at the end of their shift. To the families, thank you for your service alongside our men and women in uniform. And as we have listed the names here today of those that we have lost this year, rest easy, know that we have the watch. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
One more time. The gentlewoman yields back. Under the Speaker's announced policy of January 4th, 2021, the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Pocan, is recognized for 60 minutes as the designee of the Majority Leader.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I ask unanimous consent that members have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous material on the subject of this special order.
Without objection.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Today's special order hour is not just about the violence that has occurred in the last week in Israel and Palestine. It's not about the activities of the last month, including the displacement of Palestinian families in Sheikh Jarrah that have been largely overlooked in this region. But in many ways, it's about what's happened over the last year, the last decade, the last several decades that has dehumanized and violated the human rights of too many people in this important region. No one should have to face the reality of missiles shot at them. Hamas is causing great danger to the very people it purports to want to protect in Gaza by doing so. And those missile attacks should be condemned. But that doesn't make it a both sides issue. We must acknowledge and condemn the disproportionate discrimination and treatment that Palestinians face versus others in this region. No one should suffer the loss of life, liberty, or dignity that the Palestinian people have suffered under the Netanyahu and previous administrations in Israel during the 50-year occupation of the West Bank. When serious human rights abuses compound, such as the recent attacks on places of worship like the Al-Aqsa Mosque, the forced removal of people from their homes, most recently in East Jerusalem, but ongoing in the West Bank for way too long, the jailing and military court trials for Palestinian children, the dehumanization of the lives of the Palestinians by having roads and entrances that are separate for some people, which all too often looks like a former South Africa. The blockade and open-air prison conditions for the people in Gaza, where food and clean water is often scarce. When those types of human rights abuses occur, we're not just putting the lives of Palestinians and Israelis at risk, but we're also putting the United States at greater jeopardy. And eventually, that could mean the lives of men and women from the United States getting involved in a greater escalation of violence in the region, which none of us want to see. Today, we want to talk about the very long-term problems that have been for too long ignored by U.S. policies in the region. Fortunately, now more and more members of Congress are wanting to address peace in this region in a more forthright way. As human rights giant South African Desmond Tutu said, "If you are neutral in situations of injustice, you have chosen the side of the oppressor." We must treat everyone in Israel and Palestine with equal respect and dignity. That's the U.S. policy that we are speaking out for. I am pleased to be joined by a number of my colleagues tonight who have taken leadership positions in talking about peace in the Middle East for all people. And I would like to now yield 5 minutes to my colleague from Michigan, the first Palestinian American to serve in Congress, Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib.
Thank you so much, Mark. I'm actually, I believe, the second, but I am the only Palestinian American member of Congress now, and my mere existence has disrupted the status quo. I am so personal for me. I am a reminder to colleagues that Palestinians do indeed exist, that we are human, that we are allowed to dream. We are mothers, daughters, granddaughters. We are justice seekers and are unapologetically about our fight against oppressions of all forms. And colleagues, Palestinians aren't going anywhere no matter how much money you send to Israel's apartheid government. If we are to make good on our promises to support equal human rights for all, it is our duty to end the apartheid system that for decades has subjected Palestinians to inhumane treatment and racism. Reducing Palestinians to live in utter fear and terror of losing a child, being indefinitely detained or killed because of who they are, and the unequal rights and protections they have under Israeli law. It must end. One of Israel's most prominent human rights organizations, B'Tselem, has declared Israel an apartheid state. Human Rights Watch recently recognized it too. This is what Palestinians living under Israel's oppression have been telling us for decades. I have been told by some of my colleagues who dispute the truth about segregation, racism, and violence in Israel towards Palestinians that I need to know the history. What they mean, unintentionally or not, is that Palestinians do not have the right to tell the truth about what happened to them during the founding of Israel. They are, in effect, they erase the truth about ethnic cleansing of Palestinians in Israel, that some refer to as the Nakba, our catastrophe. As Palestinians talk about our history, know that many of my Black neighbors, indigenous communities, may not know what we mean by Nakba, but they do understand what it means to be killed, expelled from your home, land, made homeless, and stripped of your human rights. My ancestors and current family in Palestine deserve the world to hear their history without obstruction. They have a right to be able to explain to the world that they are still suffering, still being dispossessed, still being killed as the world watches and does nothing. As Peter Beinart, an American of Jewish faith, writes, quote, "When you tell a people to forget its past, you are not proposing peace. You are proposing extinction. The Palestinian story is that of being made a refugee on the lands you called home. We cannot have an honest conversation about U.S. military support for the Israeli government today without acknowledging that for Palestinians, the catastrophe of displacement and dehumanization in their homeland has been ongoing since 1948. To read the statements from President Biden, Secretary Blinken, General Austin, and leaders of both parties, you'd hardly know Palestinians existed at all. There has been no recognition of the attack on Palestinian families being ripped from their homes in East Jerusalem right now, or home demolitions. No mention of children being detained or murdered.
No recognition of a sustained campaign of harassment and terror by Israeli police against worshipers, kneeling down and praying and celebrating their holiest days in one of their holiest places. No mention of Al-Aqsa being surrounded by violence, tear gas, smoke, while people pray. Can my colleagues imagine if it was their place of worship filled with tear gas? Could you pray as stun grenades were tossed into your holiest place? Above all, there has been absolutely no recognition of Palestinian humanity. If our own State Department can't even bring itself to acknowledge the killing of Palestinian children is wrong, well, I will say it for the millions of Americans who stand with me against the killing of innocent children, no matter their ethnicity or faith. I weep for all the lives lost under the unbearable status quo, every single one, no matter their faith, their background. We all deserve freedom, liberty, peace, and justice, and it should never be denied because of our faith or ethnic background. No child, Palestinian or Israeli, whoever they are, should ever have to worry that death will rain from the sky. How many of my colleagues are willing to say the same, to stand for Palestinian human rights as they do for Israelis? There is a crushing dehumanization to how we talk about this terrible violence. The New York Post reported the Palestinian death toll as Israeli casualties. ABC says that Israelis are, quote, killed, while Palestinians simply, quote, die, as if by magic, as if they were never human to begin with. Help me understand the math. How many Palestinians have to die? Lives matter. Life under apartheid strips Palestinians of their human dignity. How would you feel if you had to go through dehumanizing checkpoints 2 blocks from your own home to go to the doctor or travel across your own land? How would you feel if you had to do it while pregnant in the scorching heat as soldiers with guns controlled your freedom? How would you feel it if you lived in Gaza, where your power and water might be out for days or weeks at a time, where you were cut off from the outside world by inhumane military blockade? Meanwhile, Palestinians' rights to nonviolent resistance have been curtailed and even criminalized. Our party leaders have spoken forcefully against BDS, calling its proponents anti-Semitic, despite the same tactics being critical to ending the South African apartheid mere decades ago. What we are telling Palestinians fighting apartheid is the same thing being told to my Black neighbors and Americans throughout that are fighting against police brutality here. There is no form of acceptable resistance to state violence. As long as the message from Washington is that our military support for Israel is unconditional, Netanyahu's extremism, right-wing government will continue to expand settlements, continue to demolish homes, and continue to make the prospects for peace impossible. 330 of my own colleagues, and Democrats and Republicans here, 75% of the body here, signed a letter pledging that Israel shall never be made to comply with basic human rights laws that other countries receive our military aid must observe. You know, when I see the images and videos of destruction and death in Palestine, all I hear are the children screaming from pure fear and terror. I want to read something a mother named Iman in Gaza wrote 2 days ago. She said, quote, "Tonight, I put the kids to sleep in our bedroom so that when we die together." And no one would live to mourn the loss of another one. The statement broke me a little more because of country policies and funding will deny this mother's right to see her own children live without fear and to grow old without painful trauma and violence. We must condition aid to Israel on compliance with international human rights and end the apartheid. We must, with no hesitation,
Demand that our country recognize the unconditional support of Israel has enabled the erasure of Palestinian life and denial of the rights of millions of refugees, and emboldens the apartheid policies that Human Rights Watch has detailed thoroughly in their recent report. I stand before you not only as a Congresswoman for the beautiful 13 districts strong, but also as a proud daughter of Palestinian immigrants and the granddaughter of a loving Palestinian grandmother living in the occupied Palestine. You take that and you combine it with the fact that I was raised in one of the most beautiful, blackest cities in America, a city where movements for civil rights and social justice are birthed, the city of Detroit. So I can't stand here. I can't stand silent when injustice exists, where the truth is obscured. If there's one thing Detroit instilled in this Palestinian girl from Southwest, it's you always speak truth to power, even if your voice shakes. The freedom of Palestinians is connected to the fight against oppression all over the world. Lastly, to my city in Palestine, Ashanik, Anawak Hannah, I stand here because of you. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you very much, Representative Tlaib, for your very personal words about the situation in Palestine. Next, I would like to yield 5 minutes to my colleague, the Pride of Minnesota, Representative Ilhan Omar.
Thank you, Congressman Mark Pocan. And I want to extend my gratitude to Marie Newmon for helping lead this important discussion. And I want to thank all of the members who are here who showed up in solidarity. Mr. Speaker, as someone who has experienced war firsthand, I have deep understanding of the suffering that comes along with it. As a child, I lived through a violent civil war that destroyed my home, ripped my family apart from each other, and killed many of my family and friends. I can still remember being just 8 years old, hiding under the bed, hearing bombs go off outside my window, and wondering if we were going to be hit next. It is trauma I will live with for the rest of my life. So I understand on a deeply human level the pain and the anguish families are feeling in Palestine and Israel at the moment, and the helplessness people feel here in the United States who have family in the region, including many of my constituents. And it is for this reason that I abhor violence. Whether rocket attacks or airstrikes, violence does nothing to make people more secure. It only furthers the interest of the powerful while costing lives, futures, and families. But we must speak out truthfully and forcefully about the seed of this conflict and about what is happening today. The truth is that this is not a conflict between two states. This is not a civil war. It is a conflict where one country, funded and supported by the United States government, continues an illegal military occupation over another group of people. This is not my description of it. This is the description of conservative Israeli leader Ariel Sharon, who in 2003 said, and I quote, "To hold 3.5 million Palestinians under occupation in my opinion, is a very bad thing for us and for them. It is an occupation, he said. You might not like this word, but it is really an occupation. To understand what is taking place at this moment, we must understand how it began. In 1948, 700,000 Palestinians were forcibly removed and uprooted from their homes in what has come to be known as the Nakba, or the catastrophe. 78% of their land was taken from them. Now consider that. 78% of their land was taken from them. Since then, 5.6 million Palestinians have been continually displaced from their homes in one of the largest and longest lasting refugee crises in human history. For decades, the United States, the United Nations, and many Israelis and Palestinians have pushed for a Palestinian state in which the Palestinians can enjoy the same rights afforded to their Israeli counterparts. But in the past several years, that hope has increasingly slipped away. The Israeli government and their far-right ethno-nationalist leader, Benjamin Netanyahu, has legally razed Palestinian ancestral homes, leveled entire neighborhoods, and violently suppressed any resistance. This is all to make way for illegal Israeli settlement outposts designed to displace Palestinians from their homes and prevent a future Palestinian state. Since 1993, when the first Oslo Peace Accord was signed, illegal settlements have increased by nearly 400,000. And Netanyahu has made explicit his goal to annex much of the West Bank, home to over 3 million Palestinians. On top of that, Palestinian movement, speech, and economic activity are severely limited. Palestinians are not allowed to leave the Gaza Strip except in extreme cases. Medical shortage are rampant, and youth unemployment was already 40% before the pandemic hit. People who protest, including young children, are routinely shot by the IDF soldiers, often killed with no consequence in Israeli courts. As a recent report by Human Rights Watch detailed, this can only be described as an apartheid, all of which brings us to the current crisis. This week, Israeli authorities were planning more forced displacement in Sheikh Jarrah, a Palestinian neighborhood in East Jerusalem, home to Palestinian refugees who had already been displaced. On Thursday, settlers began harassing and attacking Palestinians who were breaking their Ramadan fast doing a protest vigil in Sheikh Jarrah. The deputy mayor of Jerusalem joined to mock Palestinians, saying to one protester, and I quote, "Did they take the bullet out of your ass? It is a pity it didn't go here," in his head. Then, on the last Friday of the holy month of Ramadan, Israeli military forces stormed Al-Aqsa Mosque, one of the holiest sites in Islam, firing stun grenades, tear gas, and rubber bullets. Over 300 people were injured, 200 of them were hospitalized. What happened next is well known. Hamas fired rockets into Israel, which has taken the lives of 6 Israelis. And the Israeli military launched airstrikes into Gaza, targeting civilian buildings, which have already killed 69 people, including 16 children. Let me be clear. Every single death in this conflict is a tragedy. Every rocket and bomb that targets civilians is a war crime. I feel the pain of every child who's forced to hide under their beds because they fear for their life, and every parent who deals with that anguish. And I wish we as a nation treated that pain equally. But right now we are not. And instead of condemning blatant crimes against humanity and human rights abuses, Many members of Congress have instead fallen back on a blanket statement defending Israel's airstrikes against civilians under the guise of self-defense, without even a mention of the children getting killed, much less what happened at Al-Aqsa or in Shirjara. When the 15-member United Nations Security Council proposed a resolution this week calling on the Israeli government to cease settlement activities, demolition and eviction, and urging general restraint, the United States reportedly blocked it from happening. We are currently blocking the United Nations Security Council from calling on ceasefire. And to this day, we as members of Congress have not had yet a hearing or a briefing on this conflict, or gotten answers on whether our weaponry or money is being used to commit human rights abuses. So I must ask, when we defend Israeli citizens' right to peace and security, how can we at the same time ignore the 5 million Palestinians living under occupation? When we say that Israel has the right to self-defense, how can we ignore the home demolitions, settlement violence, and forced annexation of Palestinian land that is happening? And how can we say they themselves do not have the right to defend themselves? How can we pay lip service to a Palestinian state yet do absolutely nothing to make that state a reality while the Israeli government we fund tries to make it impossible? I will end with this. Today is Eid, the final day of Ramadan, one of the joyous days in the Muslim calendar. And while I would rather be spending it with my family, I know there are families who are mourning the death of their children because of this. And I owe it to them to speak out on their behalf. So I am here today to stand for our common humanity, to say that every child deserves a life free of violence and oppression. Every child deserves advocates for their humanity, for their safety, and for their security. And it should not be controversial to say the same for Palestinian children. Eid Mubarak. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you very much, Representative Omar, for those words. As we speak, it was just announced a little while ago that the Israeli military was going into Gaza. It's not clear if it's going after rocket attacks or Hamas leaders or what is happening, but that's happening at this very moment. The next person I'd like to yield to is someone who is a senior member, a very powerful member of this Congress, the person who is the chair of the Defense Subcommittee on the Appropriations Committee, and a lifelong advocate for equality for Palestinians and Israelis, Representative Betty McCollum.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank my colleague, Mr. Pocan, for his kind remarks and for being one of the organizers for tonight's special order. Tonight, I'm here to condemn violence. I'm here to speak out in support of human rights, political rights, and peace. For days, Hamas and extremists in Gaza have been firing rockets into Israel that have caused death, destruction, and fear among Israeli citizens. I condemn Hamas's actions. These attacks must stop. For 45 years, Israel has been enforcing a brutal military occupation in the West Bank that has terrorized Palestinian families. And I condemn Israel's occupation of Palestine. Israel's occupation must end. What we are witnessing in Israel, East Jerusalem, Gaza, and the West Bank, they're the bitter fruits of discrimination that has empowered Jewish extremists and Palestinian extremists. People seeking justice, equality, and peace and opportunity are sidelined, they're silenced, and they're dismissed. We are witnessing the all too familiar cycle of violence between Israel and Hamas. And today, we are witnessing Israeli cities at war. Israeli citizens are attacking each other. Israeli citizens who are Jewish and Palestinian are fighting each other. Adding to this hatred, the Israel nation-state law and other structural policies of discrimination that treat Palestinians as second-class citizens. Now, I want to be clear. Israel has the right to have their security, and it must be able to defend itself against rockets. But Palestinians have universally recognized human rights, rights that are not recognized under Israeli military occupation. Palestinians have become people without a nation. Palestinians have no government to defend them when they seek justice when their children are abused or tortured by Israel military security forces. Palestinian families cannot defend themselves when Israeli bulldozers destroy their homes and turn their lands over to Jewish settlers. Israel is an ally of the United States, and Congress supports Israel by providing military aid. And I vote for that aid package. The Iron Dome missile defense system that's stopping Hamas rockets is funded out of the Defense Appropriations Subcommittee, which I chair. And I support funding for Iron Dome, and it will be in the bill that I write this year. However, Congress sends $3.8 billion to Israel in the form of military aid to be unrestricted and unconditioned, no limits. Proponents of this unrestricted aid to Israel wrote to the Appropriations Committee, and I quote from their letter, "U.S. support of Israel makes the region safer and bolsters diplomatic efforts at achieving negotiated two-state solution, resulting in peace and prosperity for both Israelis and Palestinians." To those who support that statement, here are the facts. There are no diplomatic efforts to achieve a two-state solution. The Prime Minister of Israel has repeatedly stated he is committed to annexing Palestinian lands. There is no peace for Palestinians in East Jerusalem or the West Bank. There is an Israel military occupation that abuses and tortures Palestinian children, demolishes Palestinian homes, and steals Palestinian land. The unrestricted, unconditioned $3.8 billion in annual U.S. military aid enables, it gives a green light to Israel's occupation of Palestine because there is no accountability and there is no oversight by Congress. This must change. Not $1 of U.S. aid to Israel should go towards the military detention of Palestinian children, the annexation of Palestinian lands, or the destruction of Palestinian homes. I support everyone's universal human rights, including Palestinian rights, to live in freedom, to live with equality, with liberty, with opportunity. I want peace for the people of Israel and the people of Palestine, and I'm willing to do my part to work for justice. Rockets fired from Gaza must stop. The eviction of Palestinian families from East Jerusalem must stop. The burning of synagogues and Arab businesses must stop. And the right-wing extremists that chant, "Burn the Arabs," well, that must stop too. There is enough hate, there is enough blame to go around. And this conflict will not end until there's responsible leadership on both sides. Peace will not take root until the United States stands up for human rights and security for all people. And that includes human rights and security for the Palestinian people. The Biden administration must work for peace and direct some tough love to the Israeli government and to the Palestinian Authority. End the violence, end the discrimination, end the occupation. Israel deserves security, and Palestinians deserve self-determination and freedom. And tonight, no child should go to bed under the constant fear of violence. We should all want every Israeli, every Palestinian child to live with peace, opportunity, hope for the future. And that's what I'm working to achieve with my colleagues. So I thank you, and I yield back to Congressman Pocan.
Thank you very much, Representative McCollum, for those words. May I inquire how much time we have remaining?
Gentleman has 26 minutes remaining.
Okay, thank you. I would like to yield 4 minutes to my colleague from the state of Massachusetts, Ms. Ayanna Presley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to recognize the deep trauma and loss of life perpetuated by systems of oppression here in the United States and globally. Many times I've stood at this dais and affirmed that our destinies are tied. That was clear when protesters took to the streets in the face of police murders, seeking to build a nation where Black lives matter. That was clear when our democracy and our lives were put at risk by violent white supremacists who shattered glass and broke through while wearing anti-Semitic phrases on their chests, carrying the Confederate flag, erecting a noose on the West Lawn. That was clear when students protesting to end poverty and oppression in the streets of Bogota were shot dead. That was clear when families kneeling during this holy month at the third holiest site in Islam were met with tear gas, rubber bullets, and hand grenades. Our destinies are tied. As a Black woman in America, I am no stranger to police brutality, state-sanctioned violence. We have been criminalized for the very way we show up in the world. Last summer, when Black Lives Matter protesters took to the streets to demand justice, they were met with force. They faced tear gas, rubber bullets, and a militarized police, just as our Palestinian brothers and sisters are facing in Jerusalem today. Palestinians are being told the same thing as Black folks in America. There is no acceptable form of resistance. We are bearing witness to egregious human rights violations. The pain, trauma, and terror that Palestinians are facing is not just the result of this week's escalation, but the consequence of years of military occupation. In Sheikh Jarrah, the Israeli government is violently dispossessing yet another neighborhood of Palestinian families from homes they have lived in for decades. We cannot stand idly and complicitly by and allow the occupation and oppression of the Palestinian people to continue. We cannot remain silent when our government sends $3.8 billion of military aid to Israel that is used to demolish Palestinian homes, imprison Palestinian children, and displace Palestinian families. A budget is a reflection of our values. I'm committed to ensuring that our government does not fund state violence in any form, anywhere. Many say that conditioning aid is not a phrase that I should utter here, but let me be clear. No matter the context, American government dollars always come with conditions. The question at hand is, should our taxpayer dollars create conditions for justice, healing, and repair? Or should those dollars create conditions for oppression and apartheid? While I hold space, do space for storied history and unique lived experiences on the ground globally, there is a through line here. And whether we are talking about the militarization of our communities or weapons of war, the question is the same. If our budgets are a statement of our values, what do we value? Whose lives do we value? We have seen footage of Israeli and Palestinian children huddled fearfully while rockets blanket their homeland. No child should live in fear. No child should grow up in the midst of a conflict that robs them of a childhood, and Palestinian children do not have the same protections afforded to them. Without the U.S. exerting pressure on Israel to de-escalate, the explosive situation in Jerusalem is igniting further violence, not just but beyond. It is clear there is a grave asymmetry of power here. Palestinians do not have a sovereign state and the protections that come with it. Following forceful violence against the Palestinians simply seeking to remain in their family homes, militant groups in Gaza have launched rockets at Israeli cities, resulting in 7 deaths, including a child. In response, the Israeli military has launched severe attacks on Gaza, killing 83 people, 17 of whom are children. This is devastating. The destinies of the Israeli and Palestinian people are tied. Our outrage at the pain, violence, and oppression they face must be clear and unapologetic. Equal outrage for violence perpetrated against all people, and moral clarity when state-sanctioned violence is claiming the lives of innocent mothers, fathers, daughters, and sons. From Jerusalem to Boston, from Randolph to Gaza, from Colombia to Yemen, our destinies are tied. And everyone deserves to live free from fear and to know peace. Thank you, and I yield to the gentleman from Wisconsin.
Thank you very much for those remarks. I'm going to ask the rest of my colleagues if we can try to keep it to 3 to 4 minutes each. The good news is there are many people who are very passionate about human rights in the Middle East. The problem is we have an hour total, and I would appreciate that consideration. Next, it's an honor to introduce a colleague of mine from New York, Alexandria Ocasio-Ortez.
Thank you so much, Representative Pocan. And I think this has been a very difficult week for us as a global community, as communities that are concerned for human rights, all human rights, and in general, and in particular, the rights of Palestinians and Israelis alike that have been impacted by the fear and violence of this week. Now, what I think is, it's important is that I'll start with a story. As a little girl, my family comes from the island of Puerto Rico. And I grew up visiting my family on the island of Vieques and communities on the island of Vieques, where the United States bombed its own territories, its own communities. And I would go to sleep as a little girl to the sound of US bombs detonating. Practice is what it was called at the time, practice. And when I saw those airstrikes that are supported with US funds, I could not help but wonder if our communities were practice for this. This is our business because we are playing a role in it. And the United States must acknowledge its role in the injustice and human rights violations of Palestinians. This is not about both sides. This is about an imbalance of power. When I first got here in 2019, the Israeli government refused to admit 2 members of the United States Congress, Rashida Tlaib and Representative Ilhan Omar, into the country. Banned members of this very body because of who they were. Said it was a sign of weakness. We have to have the courage to name our contributions. And sometimes I can't help but wonder if the reason we don't do that, if we're scared to stand up to the incarceration of children in Palestine, is because maybe it'll force us to confront the incarceration of children here on our border. If by standing up to the injustices there, it will prompt us to stand up to the injustices here. We have a responsibility. And if we have historically said and committed to a role as an honest broker, then we must fulfill that role. That means we have to be honest with ourselves, with what our aid supports. We have to be honest and ask ourselves questions like why we are using our veto power and the UN Security Council in preventing statements from being released about concerns for this violence alike. The president and many other figures this week stated that Israel has a right to self-defense, and this is a sentiment that is echoed across this body. But do Palestinians have a right to survive? Do we believe that? And if so, we have a responsibility to that as well. And with that, I yield back to the representative. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for those words. It is now my honor to yield 3 minutes to the representative from Missouri, Ms. Cori Bush.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
St. Louis and I rise today in solidarity with the Palestinian people and in memory of our brother, Bassem Masri, a Ferguson activist who was with us on the front lines of our uprising for justice following the police murder of Michael Brown Jr. Bassem was a St. Louis Palestinian. Bassem also lived in Jerusalem, Palestine. Bassem was one of us. He showed up ready. As a Palestinian, he was ready to resist, to rebel, to rise up with us as our St. Louis community mourned Mike Brown Jr.'s state-sanctioned murder, and as we demanded an end to the militarized police occupation of our communities. Palestinians know what state violence, militarized policing, and occupation of their communities look like. And they've lived that reality of having to go through checkpoints while trying to live their lives. They know this reality and the reality of so much more. So when heavily militarized police forces showed up in Ferguson in 2014, Bassem and so many others of our St. Louis Palestinian community, our Palestinian siblings showed up too. I remember sitting in a circle on the grass near where Michael Brown Jr. was murdered. And I remember them describing to us what to do when militarized law enforcement shot us with rubber bullets or when they tear gassed us. I remember learning that the same equipment that they used to brutalize us is the same equipment that we send to the Israeli military to police and brutalize Palestinians. I remember Bassem putting his life on the line with us. I remember him live streaming for the whole world to see our struggle. I remember our solidarity, and I remember the harassment, the extortion, the brutalization he faced for resisting with us. That harassment, that extortion, that brutalization by a heavily armed militarized presence in our community, that's what we fund when our government sends our tax dollars to the Israeli military. St. Louis sent me here to save lives. Bassem's loved ones and his community, our St. Louis community, sent me here to save lives. So that means we oppose our money going to fund militarized policing, occupation, and systems of violent oppression and trauma. We are anti-war, we are anti-occupation, and we are anti-apartheid, period. If this body is looking for something productive to do with $3 million, instead of funding a military that polices and kills Palestinians, I have some communities in St. Louis City and in St. Louis County where that money can go, where we desperately need investment, where we are hurting, where we need help. Let us prioritize funding there. Prioritize funding life, not destruction. So today, we remember Bassem. We remember his resistance in the face of militarized police occupation as a St. Louisan and a Palestinian. We lost him to a health crisis, but we remember his words today. Until all our children are safe, we will continue to fight for our rights in Palestine and in Ferguson. We stand with you in solidarity. Thank you.
Thank you. May I inquire on how much time we have left?
The gentleman has 13 minutes.
Great. Thank you very much. I would like to yield 3 minutes to a great colleague and mentor of mine, Representative Jan Schakowsky from Illinois.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. I am horrified and saddened by the ongoing escalation of violence in Gaza and in Israel. We have now seen over 1,800 rockets being fired indiscriminately at Israel's citizens who are now fleeing for their lives. Yes, I believe that Israel does have a right to defend herself. Now 103 Palestinians and 7 Israelis are dead, including children. It is so painful, this cycle of violence that we see over and over again. Yes, I believe Israel does have the right to defend herself, but in the end, there are no winners. The United States can play a role. The Biden administration has dispatched the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State, his name is Hadi Amr, to Israel, and he is his job is to deal with the situation in Israel and Palestine. And I am hopeful that we will see a de-escalation and a ceasefire. But a return to status quo is simply not enough. Earlier this week, prior to the attacks, I was deeply disturbed by the intentional and the intended evacuation of Palestinian families, some of whom have been in their homes for decades. The Biden administration, through its National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, has also conveyed its consternation, its concern about the evictions, and has called and has urged the administration to remain heavily involved to secure to address the root causes of this violence, including ongoing evictions, displacements, and occupation, as it works to secure a ceasefire. The violence must end now, and we must work to enable dialogue that can lead to a just, safe, and secure future for both Israelis and Palestinians. And I yield back.
Thank you very much for those words, Representative Schakowsky. It is now my honor to yield 3 minutes to Representative Chuy Garcia from the state of Illinois.
Thank you, Representative Pocan, to members of the body. The occupation must end, and there must be a just solution for both peoples. We cannot keep turning a blind eye to the practices that rob people of their generational homes and detaining children. Israeli and Palestinian families want to raise their children in safety and in peace, and we've got to take firm diplomatic steps to support those goals. While the evictions in West Jerusalem and the hostilities around Al-Aqsa Mosque seem to have provoked the latest escalation and violence, we've got to take a hard look at how the situation has changed in recent years. The Biden administration must reverse Trump's detrimental actions and take steps to ensure that U.S. aid to Israel cannot be used for seizure or destruction of Palestinian homes. We've also got to continue humanitarian aid to Palestinian territories. The use of war-grade weapons and the killing of civilians must stop. I've always strongly supported a rights-based approach and a two-state solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And the current situation makes it more crucial than ever that we pursue viable pathways toward equality, self-determination, and peace. I sincerely thank Mr. Pocan and the Progressive Caucus for putting this special hour together. I hope and pray that the death and self-destruction will end and that we may work on a peaceful solution centered on the humanity and the rights of all involved. I yield back to Representative Pocan.
Thank you very much for those words. It is now my honor to introduce from the state of Indiana, the extremely patient, because he's been here for nearly an hour waiting to speak, Representative Andre Carson.
Thank you, Congressman Pocan. You know, Mr. Speaker, I rise today in solidarity with the Palestinian people as they face grave injustices, violence, and certainly abuse. And I join the countless people around the world, Mr. Speaker, who are vehemently opposed to the planned forced evictions of Palestinians in Sheikh Jarrah and saddened by the escalating violence that threatens Israelis and Palestinians alike. We must condemn all forms of violence and mourn the loss of both Palestinian lives and Israeli lives. I stand here today as one of 3 Muslims serving in Congress on Eid Day, heartbroken to see the attacks on worshipers at the Al-Aqsa Mosque, one of the holiest sites of Islam and our holiest month of the year, by the Israeli government. For decades, Israel has violated international law and basic human rights through its systematic displacement of Palestinians. For too long, America has looked the other way as Israel has engaged in this horrific campaign against Palestinians. Now, Israel is our security partner. In fact, the U.S. alone gives Israel billions of dollars per year. But we must make sure that our taxpayer dollars are not being used to fund human rights violations. Enough is enough. America has a moral obligation to use our influence to protect the victims of human rights violations, including the Palestinian people. And we must work to strengthen our work to bring peace to this region. This is our moral responsibility to do the right thing. It's not about Jews versus Muslims or Israel versus its neighbors. It's about right versus wrong. And let me be clear, Israel's decade of forced displacement is wrong. That's why we're working hard in Congress to make things right. Our American government must enforce international law and our own foundational principles. And our allies, like Israel, must be held accountable for human rights violations. Now, we're going to keep working hard in Congress to pass much-needed legislation that achieves accountability, equality, and justice for all. America is great, powerful, probably the greatest nation in recorded history. But America's complex. It's a complicated work in progress. For centuries, she has engaged in and enabled the mistreatment of countless people, from the slavery enshrined in this Constitution against Africans, to the taking of land from Native Americans, or the shameful support of dictators beyond our shores. But today we face an inflection point, a reckoning of whether we will stand up for the values we claim to cherish, or if we will turn a blind eye to repeated violations of human rights. We cannot turn our backs now. We must recognize that this is an international struggle and stick by the words of Dr. King when he said, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." I'm thankful for Dr. King and for the long list of great Americans who have helped bend the arc of the moral universe toward justice. We stand on the shoulders and march in their footsteps as we advance their legacy and boldly stand up to protect the human rights of the Palestinian people. By working together, we can ensure that America uses her power for good in Palestine and around the world. Let's keep up this momentum. Let's help secure justice for the Palestinian people. Let's work for peace. Let's never give up. I yield back to Congressman Pocan.
Great. Thank you very much for your words. And finally, I know we're short on time. I'd like to yield to my colleague from Texas, Representative Joaquin Castro.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I rise today with grave concern about the ongoing violence in Israel and Palestine. The events of the last week and the deaths of so many Israeli and Palestinian civilians, including many children, are heartbreaking. My condolences to their families, and my thoughts are with those in Israel and Gaza who continue to live in fear. Rocket attacks by Hamas and other militant groups that intentionally target civilians are of course reprehensible, and I condemn them unequivocally. The escalation of violence is not in the interest of Israelis or Palestinians, but only extremists that thrive on conflict. The Biden administration needs to call on the Israeli government to agree to a ceasefire and put pressure on Hamas to do the same. I have consistently supported security assistance to Israel and voted to fund the Iron Dome, which is saving lives as we speak. Yet Israel's disproportionate response to Hamas's attacks, destroying entire buildings and public spaces, is exacerbating this horrible cycle of violence. These airstrikes, which have already resulted in the deaths of civilians and at least 38 women and children, must stop. We need a ceasefire now, and the United States must help bring one about. Beyond stopping the immediate violence, the United States must also urge Israel to support the creation of a Palestinian state, the only way to end this cycle of violence for good. The status quo of occupation and creeping de facto annexation is unjust and not sustainable. The forced eviction of Palestinian families in East Jerusalem are wrong. And it's not the first time that events like we saw last week in Sheikh Jarrah. Prime Minister Netanyahu's right-wing government. Can I get 30 more seconds?
I think if you can squeeze it out because it's the end of our hour.
Sure.
This time has expired.
I'll just wrap up by saying that I hope and pray for peace. I want to thank my colleague, Rashida Tlaib. I think part of what's been missing in this Congress is hearing from Palestinian voices. I yield back.
The gentleman's time has expired. Okay. Under the Speaker's announced policy of January 4th, 2021, the chair recognizes the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Schweikert, for 30 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Tonight I'm going to actually try to do something that's a little tricky, but I'm going to first sort of explain the theme, and then I'm going to sort of walk through some of the backup material. We understand right now our brothers and sisters on the left have, another $4.5 trillion of spending, maybe it's $5 trillion, in the pipeline. A couple major multi-spending of that, let's call it that $4.5 trillion over the next 10 years. They claim to have about $3 trillion in tax increases coming to pay for it. The reality, and I'll hopefully be able to do this over the next couple of weeks as we try to get more details and work through it line by line, it also requires that you hit every mark on the revenue raised, that all sorts of programs expire, which is really unlikely around here, and also certain spending expires. It's just not real. So our top of the napkin math right now is, at best over the 10 years, it's a couple $1 trillion of new revenue. Well, one of the set of revenues it's being discussed is, well, let's tax the wealthy. Okay. Except when you walk through the math there, let's raise capital gains tax, let's raise basis, let's raise individuals' income tax, and also then you add in, let's raise taxes on corporations. Fine. But we're already starting to see the data coming in saying just going to the 28% on the corporate tax rate is 1 million jobs over the next 24 months. Okay, so the Democrat Party wipes out 1 million jobs and takes, I think it was a little less, like 119 billion or something off just the GDP from those 2 years. And you start to lay out, that's just the corporate income tax. Now start to do the capital gains, which the beauty of capital gains is it's risk-taking. It's the type of investment that makes the working poor less poor. It's the type of investment that takes risk that makes us more productive. Because you all remember your high school economics class. What are the two ways a worker gets paid more? Inflation, which means you got paid more, but it didn't get you anything, or productivity. And without that risk capital, you lose that productivity investment. So, if the Democrats really intend to spend that much money and really intend to keep driving up the debt and deficits the way they are, I want to make a modest proposal of where they could find some offsets. And I'm shocked this isn't discussed more around here. Instead of marching in and saying, we're going to tax rich people, even though much of that money actually goes to create jobs and investment and economic growth and productivity growth for our brothers and sisters who are in the hard-working class, why don't we stop subsidizing the rich? I'm going to show a number of boards here today on how this government takes some of the very, very, very wealthiest in this country and, on one hand, says, pay the taxes. Oh, by the way, we're going to hand you back the cash. I'm going to show you one board where individuals with multi-million-dollar houses on the beach then get dramatically subsidized flood insurance from the federal general fund. And over and over and over. If this is the path the Democrats intend to go, could they consider cutting spending? Because cutting that spending would be much less distortionary, if that's an actual word, distorting the economy, because the taxes being discussed right now are going to hurt the economy. They're going to hurt working people, and they're going to really hurt the working poor. So if you need this much revenue, and our back of the napkin math right is about $1.4 trillion over the 10 years in subsidies that could be cut for that very top fraction of income earners, wealth holders in the United States. So there's a place to get your revenue without creating the economic distortion being discussed right now. So let's first talk about the reality of where we are at as a people, as a society, as a country. How many actually right now know the latest numbers from CBO on how much trouble we're in just on Medicare? The 30-year window right now on Medicare is $71 trillion shortfall just in Medicare. Remember, in Medicare only it has, the A, the B, the C, the D, but Part A, which is the hospital portion, is the only part we collect as part of your FICA tax. Everything else ultimately comes out of the general fund. And we always talk about Part B and Part D because Part C is the managed care portion. But if you look at the actual outlays of the program, and then you actually look at the interest cost, and remove the Part A, the hospital portion, it's 71 trillion, and it's just Medicare. And this is, I'm just stunned more members of Congress don't actually understand this, are willing to tell their constituents the truth. That Medicare number represents 67% of the deficit debt shortfall over that 30 years. Once again, the Medicare shortfall is 67% of the debt we're going to be in 30 years. So we take that. Now let's add in Social Security. Social Security is actually in better shape. It functionally has only about a $28 trillion fall over the next years, because you reach in, you take the portion of the trust fund, and here's the trust fund portion. You see the green sliver? Then the rest are what we predict as incoming payroll taxes. Then here's the program's outlays, and then the interest on the shortfall. And so work with me. If Medicare is 71 trillion, Social Security is 28 trillion. Right there, you're at what, $99 trillion of the debt is driven by just Social Security and Medicare. Well, the good news is, if it's that, The rest of the budget over that 30-year window is actually only about $3 trillion short. So in a perverse way, the rest of the budget actually is, well, out of balance by only $3 trillion. It's pretty close to being in balance on the type of numbers we're using here in Washington today. So there should be just a fixation if this body actually cared about retirement security, cared about the future, cared about everyone from my 5-year-old daughter who's going to be paying these taxes to hopefully myself who will be receiving some of these benefits. We actually cared. There should be an absolute fixation on these numbers. Instead, there's a fixation here on spending more money and spending money that we can show you actually is going to shrink the economy and unemploy a lot more Americans. It's hopefully more as, trying to speak as an economist with some passion. If you actually look at post-tax reform, post some of the regulatory rationalization, some of the, and maybe some good luck. If you look at 2018, 2019, that should be the goal to get back to what was happening in the economy in those years. Because if you take a look, after the tax reform, workers and were receiving substantially larger portion of the value of that tax reform. It was substantially a miracle, but I want to show you one of my favorite slides here. If you look at the number of Americans in 2018, 2019 that were in poverty, you do realize we had a couple of the lowest years, actually the lowest years in history of our brothers and sisters, our fellow Americans in poverty. If you look at the lines for African Americans, Hispanics, Anglos, this is supposed to be the goal. You do understand we had the couple of years where income inequality dramatically shrank, and it didn't shrink because rich people were getting less rich. It shrank because poor people, particularly the working poor, were getting less poor and fairly dramatically less poor. And here's actually maybe a perverse reason the left is fixated on wanting to, in one hand, raise the taxes on the wealthy, and on the other hand, hand them a bunch of subsidies. Well, there's also a very ugly political reason when you hand people subsidies. Yeah, maybe they help your campaign, maybe they pay attention to you. But if you actually take a look at 2013 to 2016, see the orange bar here? That was the gain of wealth of the wealthy. The blue, the poorest portion of Americans. The income inequality gap under those Obama years actually grew dramatically. The rich did get richer. The poor did get poorer. When Republicans provided tax reform, when we actually cleaned up much of the regulatory system, you know what happened? The value of working people's labor went up fairly dramatically. And our brothers and sisters, who we refer to often as blue collar, the working poor, they actually got substantially wealthier. Their income, their labor became much more valuable. And the rich didn't even keep close. It was like 3 times the differential. So when someone tells you during the last administration, well, the rich were getting richer and the poor were getting poorer, they're lying to you. They're just not actually looking at the math. It turns out tax reform, regulatory reform, actually made the poor much less poor. It didn't shrink the pie. It actually made prosperity across the country. And then we hit this damn virus. So we look at the brilliance of what we've done in this last year. And you start to realize the economic violence we're committing on the poor. Actually, before we do this board, what are some of the things you can do to really crush the working poor in your country? Open up the borders. Make those who may not have finished high school, that what they sell is their talent and their labor. They may not have high skill sets. And for so long, that skill set didn't have enough value in this economy. And then in 2018 and 2019, we saw the working poor get dramatically less poor because their labor became much more valuable. When you open up the border, you flood the marketplace with those who compete with them with similar skill sets. You make the poor less poor. And we have lots of data. A couple of weeks ago, I actually showed some charts that showed one of the most vicious things, economic violence you can commit to the working poor, is having an open border. But what's the number two thing? It's what we've been hearing about the last couple of days. When you see this type of inflation on gasoline, on commodity foods, on being able to put a roof over your head, you know, the middle class, it hurts. The upper classes, they actually make money because they hold lots of assets. They're getting richer now. But if you're part of that working poor, that blue collar working class that did so well in the previous couple years, they're getting their heads kicked in right now because we have pumped in so many dollars chasing so few goods. We're kicking the poor in their head. And it's the policies coming out of this place that are doing it to them. And yet, the third leg of how you make the poor less poor is work, that attachment to the value of their labor that businesses, concerns, others that need them, that help them raise their skill sets, that help them build their seniority. And yet we have a system right now, and you can see in this chart, where in much of the country, we're paying people more money to stay home than take the employment. And you do realize right now you may be a hero if you're a member of Congress and you've been voting to do this enhanced unemployment benefits. But in the future, when those things start to run out and they've lost a year, 2 years of skills, of seniority, of moving up in the organization they are employed by, you explain to them why their lifetime wages have been crushed. And much of this, some of this is also driven by the teachers' unions playing games of not opening up. And do we understand the level of economic dislocation that these policies are going to give us, not this year, not next year, but maybe for the coming decade? So let's actually go back to my previous theme. We see that economic robustness, vitality, opportunity, economic growth is moral. If this place truly cares and claims they care about workers and the working poor, now we're about to do the next round of economic kick in the head by, well, we're going to call it taxing the wealthy, but we're also going to remove the very capital out of the markets that go to the investments that make us more productive, that make it so we can hire and pay people. And you already saw the one study, and I have it right over here on the chair, that says just the corporate tax hike will unemploy 1 million Americans in the first 24 months. So let's actually walk through and see how bold and how economically literate the left is around here. Here is National Flood Insurance Program. Well, it turns out that actually, if you look at the chart over here, where much of the subsidized spending coming from the general fund, it's for the folks that are 165% of the mean income and up. And actually, we were trying to work out another chart that showed that it was actually some of the top 1, 2, 3% of income earners and wealth holders in the entire country were actually getting the substantial portion of the subsidized flood insurance. If you need more money to keep spending, maybe cut some of the spending where you are subsidizing the very people you're threatening to tax. It's a really creative, simple idea. Cut some spending. And you can cut the spending on the very people that you vilify so much. And look, a couple of these are uncomfortable, but it's still the math. If you look at some of the top wealth households in the nation, and you take a look at how much money will go to those individuals in everything from Social Security, Medicare, other types of programs, we really need to understand does it make sense to play this shell game of saying Democrats are going to raise the taxes on the rich, okay, but we're going to turn around and hand you all these benefits and hand you all these subsidies through the other hand. It's an irrational sort of washing machine of the money. So another one I'll give you is you take a number of the subsidies that go to agriculture and take the sliver that are the wealthiest holders of those agribusinesses. Guess where the substantial portion of the subsidies go? So on one hand, you're saying, we're going to tax you more, but we're going to turn around and hand you back the commodity subsidies. It's an irrational plan, once again, devoid of basic math and basic economics that the Democrats are proposing. And who knows, maybe it's great politics saying we're going to tax the rich. I mean, we see the polling. Many of the Republican base aren't particularly thrilled. We know the Democrat base vilifies them, even though that's where much of the left actually gets their money. But it's just bad economics. Do we want to step back into the days when, for great politics, we did things that truly crushed the workers, the working poor in this country, by making the economy smaller than it should be, slowing down economic growth, but slowing down also those investments that make us more productive, that make it so we can pay our brothers and sisters more. So my challenge to the left is, we've been working up the numbers now for a couple of weeks. Brian Riddell of the Manhattan Institute has a great article that's about to be published, walking through lots of these numbers. Take it for your consideration. Brian's number is about $1 trillion of subsidies that go to the rich. Our number is about 1.4 trillion over the 10 years that go to the rich. We've added in flood insurance and a couple other programs that we thought about. But the last part of this thought experiment, you're telling me it's absolutely ethical that saying on one end, I want to tax these folks more, but oh, by the way, here's your subsidy to buy your electric car. Here's your subsidy to buy the solar panels. Here's your subsidy to have a multi-million-dollar house in a flood zone. Here's your subsidy. This is irrational economics. It's irrational policy. And the only reason a political party would continue to support it is they understand it's the shiny objects that gets used for additional political support. And that's a cynical, dark thing for our friends on the left to continue to do. So that's my thought experiment for this evening. We're going to try to add some more detail on these numbers over the coming weeks. And with that, Mr. Speaker, we'll yield back to you.
Gentleman yields back. Pursuant to Section 11B of House Resolution 188, the House stands adjourned until 9 a.m. tomorrow.